The library was quiet that evening, the faint hum of the overhead lights and the soft rustling of pages the only sounds filling the air. I had always loved this place, the rows of well-worn books, the smell of aged paper, the sense of calm that seemed to settle over anyone who entered. It was here that I first met Professor Harrington, though he had been retired from teaching for several years by then. He was an institution in his own right, his reputation for brilliance matched only by his reputation for being somewhat of an enigma. It was a chance encounter. I had been deep in the philosophy section, leafing through a thick volume, when I heard his voice, low and thoughtful. "You might find the works of Deleuze more suited to what you're looking for," he murmured, his tone soft yet confident. I turned, surprised, to find him standing there, his eyes crinkling with a hint of a smile. "Oh, thank you," I replied, caught off guard. "I'm actually trying to make sense of a few concepts for an essay." He nodded, the hint of a smile remaining on his face. "Mind if I take a look?" His gaze was warm, yet there was an intensity there that I hadn't expected, a quiet curiosity that drew me in. I handed him the book, and as his fingers brushed mine, a spark of something unnameable passed between us. For a moment, I found myself caught in the depths of his gaze, feeling the quiet strength of his presence, the wisdom etched into the lines of his face. He was in his mid-60s, his hair silver and his features softened by age, but there was a warmth in his eyes, a kindness that felt grounding, reassuring. As he read, I found myself watching him, noting the way he furrowed his brow in concentration, the way his hands, large yet gentle, held the book with reverence. After a few moments, he looked up, meeting my gaze with a softness that made my heart race unexpectedly. "You're exploring some profound ideas," he said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. "Not many young people are willing to dive into such complex territory." I felt a warmth spread through me, both from his words and the way he looked at me. "Thank you. I suppose I've always been drawn to the deeper questions," I admitted, feeling a little vulnerable yet inexplicably drawn to share with him. He smiled then, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "You remind me of myself at your age," he murmured, his tone thoughtful, almost nostalgic. We spent the next hour talking, our conversation flowing effortlessly, each question leading to another, each thought deepening the connection that seemed to grow between us. I felt a kinship with him, a shared understanding that went beyond words, and by the time we finally parted ways, I knew that this was only the beginning of something significant. Over the next few weeks, our paths continued to cross at the library. Each time, we would fall into conversation, our discussions growing deeper, more personal, until it felt as though we had known each other for far longer than a few weeks. There was a warmth between us, a familiarity that felt both exhilarating and a little terrifying, a connection that seemed to defy explanation. One evening, as the library was closing, we found ourselves lingering by the philosophy section once more. Professor Harrington reached out, his hand brushing mine in a touch that was both tentative and grounding. "Would you mind staying a bit longer?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his gaze meeting mine with an intensity that left me breathless. "I'd like that," I replied softly, my heart racing as I felt the weight of the moment settle over us, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between us, a bond that felt as fragile as it was profound. We moved to a quieter corner of the library, away from prying eyes, and for a moment, we simply sat there in silence, letting the quiet envelop us. Professor Harrington's hand rested on the table, close to mine, and I found myself drawn to the warmth of his presence, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him. "You know," he began, his voice soft, thoughtful, "I never expected to feel this way, to find a connection like this, especially at my age." His gaze held mine, filled with a vulnerability that made my heart ache. I swallowed, feeling my pulse quicken as I took in the quiet honesty in his eyes, the unspoken emotions that lingered in the space between us. "I didn't expect it either," I admitted, my voice barely audible, filled with a mix of fear and longing. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words, with a tension that felt as though it had been building for a long time, waiting for a moment like this. He reached out then, his hand covering mine, his touch warm, grounding, and I felt myself lean into him, drawn to the comfort of his presence, the quiet strength that held me steady. "Sometimes life surprises us," he murmured, his voice a gentle whisper, filled with a warmth that made my heart race. "Sometimes it gives us a connection we weren't looking for, but can't ignore." Our eyes met, and in that moment, I felt a surge of emotions, both familiar and foreign, rise within me, a feeling that left me breathless, exposed, yet filled with a sense of peace, of belonging. I squeezed his hand gently, a silent acknowledgement of the bond we shared, a connection that felt as natural as breathing. We sat there in the quiet, our hands still entwined, sharing soft glances and gentle touches, the warmth of his presence filling me with a joy I couldn't explain. It was a moment I knew I would carry with me, a memory that would linger long after the evening had ended. As the librarian announced the closing, Professor Harrington and I stood, his hand slipping from mine, but the warmth of his touch remaining with me, grounding me in the reality of our connection. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "For sharing this with me." I smiled, feeling my heart race as I looked into his eyes. "Thank you," I replied softly, my voice filled with gratitude, with the quiet joy of having found someone who understood, who saw me in a way that few others did. As we parted ways, I felt a quiet joy settle over me, a warmth that filled every inch of my being, grounding me in the beauty of the moment, in the quiet magic of our shared connection. It was a memory I knew would linger, a reminder of the beauty of unexpected connections, of the quiet magic that had brought us together. The following days were filled with a quiet thrill, an anticipation that lingered every time I stepped into the library, hoping to see Professor Harrington again. The memory of our shared moment, his hand resting warmly on mine, his gaze holding a depth that left me breathless, seemed to follow me everywhere. Each encounter with him had woven a thread between us, drawing us closer in ways both subtle and undeniable. One afternoon, as I sat in my usual corner by the philosophy section, absorbed in a thick volume, I felt a presence beside me. I looked up, my heart skipping a beat as I met his familiar, gentle gaze. "Lost in thought again?" he asked, his voice warm with a hint of amusement, his eyes crinkling in that way that I'd come to adore. "Something like that," I replied with a smile, setting the book aside, my heart racing with the thrill of seeing him again. "Though I think I was secretly hoping you'd show up." His smile softened, and he pulled a chair closer, settling in beside me. "It seems I'm becoming as drawn to this place as you are," he murmured, his voice carrying a quiet warmth that made my pulse quicken. We fell into conversation effortlessly, discussing philosophy, literature, and even our own lives in ways that felt deeper, more intimate than ever before. There was a vulnerability in his words, a willingness to share pieces of himself that he seemed to keep hidden from the world. I found myself doing the same, opening up to him in ways that felt both exhilarating and terrifying, feeling the quiet intensity of our connection growing with each passing moment. At one point, he reached out, his hand covering mine in a gesture that was both grounding and electric. His touch was gentle, his fingers tracing small patterns along the back of my hand, a gesture so simple, yet filled with an unspoken warmth that left me breathless. "You're one of the few people who's made me feel truly understood," he admitted softly, his gaze meeting mine with a vulnerability that made my heart ache. I squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of his words settle over me, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond we had built. "I feel the same way," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's like you see me in a way that no one else does." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words, with a tension that felt as though it had been building for a long time, waiting for a moment like this. His gaze lingered on mine, filled with a tenderness that made my heart race, and I felt myself leaning into him, drawn to the warmth of his presence, the quiet strength of his touch. As the library around us grew quieter, the world outside fading away, it felt as though we were wrapped in a cocoon of shared understanding, of a bond that defied explanation. His fingers traced gentle circles along my wrist, each touch sending a thrill through me, grounding me in the beauty of the moment, in the quiet magic of our connection. After a while, he spoke, his voice soft, filled with an emotion that mirrored my own. "I never thought I'd find a connection like this, especially now," he murmured, his gaze holding mine with an intensity that left me breathless. "It's something I hadn't even dared to hope for." I felt a surge of emotion rise within me, a mixture of joy and vulnerability that made my heart race. "Neither did I admitted, my voice trembling slightly, filled with the weight of everything I was feeling but hadn't dared to say. "But I'm grateful for it for you." He smiled, his hand tightening around mine, his touch a quiet affirmation of everything we had shared, a reminder of the beauty of our bond. "Would you?" He hesitated, his gaze softening as he searched for the right words. "Would you be willing to join me for coffee sometime? Somewhere outside these walls." My heart raced at his invitation, a thrill of excitement and nervousness washing over me. "I'd love that," I replied, my voice filled with a warmth I couldn't hide. "I'd love nothing more." Our hands remained entwined, our fingers tracing gentle patterns along each other's skin, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond we had built, of the connection that had drawn us together in ways both subtle and profound. As we sat there, the library around us fading into the background, I felt a peace settle over me, a quiet joy that reminded me of the strength of our connection, of the beauty of everything we had shared. When it was finally time to part, Professor Harrington walked me to the door, his hand slipping from mine but the warmth of his touch lingering, grounding me in the reality of our bond. "Until next time," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet hope that mirrored my own. "Until next time," I replied, my gaze holding his as I turned to leave, feeling a quiet joy settle over me, a warmth that filled every inch of my being. It was a memory I knew would linger, a reminder of the beauty of unexpected connections, of the quiet magic that had brought us together. The days leading up to our coffee meeting were filled with a quiet thrill that stayed with me long after I'd left the library that evening. The anticipation of seeing Professor Harrington outside the familiar walls of a library, in a place where it would just be the two of us, made my heart race. I found myself replaying each moment we'd shared in the library, the warmth of his hand over mine, the intensity in his gaze, the gentle weight of his words that had carried an unspoken depth. When the day finally arrived, I found myself arriving at the cafe early, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nerves. The cafe was cozy and intimate, filled with soft lighting and the gentle hum of quiet conversations. I chose a table by the window, watching the world outside, feeling the minutes stretch as I waited. When he walked in, I felt a warmth wash over me, grounding me in the familiarity of his presence. He spotted me quickly, a small smile breaking across his face as he made his way over. "I hope I didn't keep you waiting long," he said, his voice warm and filled with a softness that made my heart ache. "Not at all," I replied, smiling as I gestured for him to sit. He settled into the chair across from me, his gaze holding mine for a moment longer than necessary, a quiet warmth in his eyes that mirrored my own. We ordered our drinks, falling into conversation as easily as we always did. But here, outside the confines of the library, it felt different, more personal, more vulnerable. Each shared glance, each gentle laugh, carried with it a deeper meaning, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between us, a connection that defied explanation. As we talked, I found myself sharing more than I had intended, pieces of my life, my dreams, my fears. And he did the same, his stories filled with a mix of wisdom and gentle humor that left me feeling seen, understood, in a way that few people had ever managed. There was a quiet intensity in his gaze, a warmth that left me breathless, and I felt myself drawn to him, captivated by the quiet strength of his presence. After a while, he reached across the table, his hand covering mine in a touch that was both grounding and electrifying. His thumb traced gentle circles over my knuckles, his touch filled with a warmth that left me trembling. "You know," he murmured softly, his gaze meeting mine with an intensity that took my breath away, I never thought I'd find this kind of connection again, especially at this stage in my life. His words left me speechless, a quiet affirmation of everything I had been feeling but hadn't dared to voice. I feel the same way, I replied, my voice barely a whisper. It's something I never expected, but it feels real. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words, with a tension that had been building between us, slowly, beautifully, with each shared moment. His hand tightened around mine, his gaze softening, filled with a vulnerability that mirrored my own. For a moment, we simply sat there, our hands entwined, the world outside fading away, leaving only the two of us, wrapped in a quiet intimacy that felt as natural as breathing. There was a tenderness in his touch, a warmth in his gaze that left me feeling both exhilarated and exposed, as though he saw every part of me, even the parts one hadn't dared to share with anyone else. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice a gentle murmur that filled the space between us. "Would you like to take a walk with me?" His question was filled with a quiet hope, a longing that mirrored the emotions swirling within me. "I'd love to," I replied, feeling a surge of warmth spread through me as I stood, his hand still holding mine as we left the cafe. We walked in comfortable silence, our hands entwined, each step filled with an unspoken understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had drawn us together. The evening air was cool, filled with the scent of rain-soaked earth, and as we strolled through the quiet streets, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet joy that reminded me of the strength of our connection, of the beauty of everything we had shared. His hand was warm in mine, his presence grounding me, filling me with a sense of belonging that I hadn't known I was searching for. Eventually, we found ourselves by the river, standing side by side, watching the water ripple under the soft glow of the streetlights. The silence between us was filled with unspoken words, with a tension that felt both thrilling and bittersweet, and for a moment, we simply stood there, lost in each other's gaze, the world around us falling away. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with a quiet intensity that left me breathless. "For being here, for sharing this with me." I turned to him, feeling a warmth settle over me, grounding me in the beauty of the moment. "Thank you," I replied softly, my voice filled with emotion. "For everything." He reached out, his hand lifting to gently cup my cheek, his thumb brushing over my skin in a touch that was both tender and electrifying. His gaze held mine, filled with a vulnerability that made my heart ache, and in that moment, I felt a surge of emotions, both familiar and foreign, rise within me, a feeling that left me breathless, exposed, yet filled with a sense of peace, of belonging. When his lips met mine, it was a soft, tentative kiss, filled with a gentleness that took my breath away. His hand cradled my face, his touch warm and steady, grounding me in the reality of the moment. The kiss deepened, each touch, each caress, a quiet exploration, a dance of shared understanding that left me feeling both exhilarated and safe. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, wrapped in each other's warmth, letting the quiet speak the words we couldn't say, the world around us fading into the background, leaving only the two of us, bound together in a bond that felt as natural as breathing. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and trembling, he looked at me, his gaze filled with a tenderness that made my heart ache. "I don't know what this means," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly, filled with a mixture of fear and longing. "But I know I don't want to lose it." I nodded, feeling a tear slip down my cheek, the weight of our emotions settling over me like a soft blanket. "Me neither," I replied, my voice filled with a quiet resolve. "Whatever this is, it feels too important to ignore." We stood there in the fading light, holding each other close, letting the silence speak the words we couldn't say. It was a moment filled with both beauty and pain, a reminder of the complexity of love, of the quiet magic of unexpected connections. As the evening deepened and the world grew quiet around us, I felt a peace settle over me, a warmth that filled every inch of my being, grounding me in the beauty of the moment, in the quiet magic of our bond. The days that followed our shared moment by the river were a mix of quiet joy and a heavy uncertainty. The memory of his touch, his gentle kiss, and the vulnerable look in his eyes stayed with me, lingering in the corners of my mind, filling me with a warmth I hadn't known I was searching for. But alongside that warmth came a complex web of emotions, guilt, fear, and a longing that couldn't simply be ignored. Each time we met, our connection seemed to grow stronger, pulling us closer in ways neither of us could fully comprehend. The library became our sanctuary, a place where we could exist in our own world, away from prying eyes and the reality outside its walls. We would find quiet corners to sit together, sharing soft conversations and subtle glances that spoke of the emotions we dared not voice aloud. Every touch, every lingering look, carried a weight, an acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between us. One evening, as the library was about to close, Professor Harrington approached me, his gaze filled with a quiet intensity that left me breathless. "Would you come with me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his hand reaching out to gently grasp mine. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, a silent plea that echoed the turmoil I felt within myself. Without hesitation, I nodded, letting him lead me out into the cool night air. We walked in silence, our hands entwined, each step filled with the unspoken words that lingered between us. Eventually, we found ourselves back at the river, the soft glow of the streetlights casting shadows over the water. We stopped, standing side by side, our gazes fixed on the gentle ripples that moved with the current. "Sometimes I wonder how we ended up here," he murmured, his voice filled with a mixture of wonder and sorrow. "How two people from such different worlds could find something so profound." His hand tightened around mine, his fingers tracing gentle circles over my skin, grounding me in the reality of our bond. "I wonder the same," I replied softly, my voice trembling with the weight of my emotions. "But I can't ignore it, what we have. It feels too real." He turned to me, his gaze meeting mine with a tenderness that made my heart ache. "I don't know what the future holds, or what any of this means," he whispered, his voice filled with a quiet desperation that mirrored my own. "But I know that being with you has made me feel alive in ways I hadn't thought possible." His words hung in the air, a confession that left me breathless, and in that moment, I felt a surge of emotions, both exhilarating and terrifying, rise within me. Without thinking, I reached up, my hand cradling his face as I leaned in, our lips meeting in a kiss that was filled with everything we hadn't dared to say. It was a kiss that spoke of love, of fear, of the undeniable connection that had drawn us together. The world around us faded, leaving only the two of us, wrapped in each other's warmth, lost in a moment that felt both timeless and fleeting. His arms wrapped around me, holding me close, grounding me in the reality of our bond, a connection that felt as natural as breathing. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and trembling, his gaze met mine, filled with a mixture of joy and sorrow, a quiet acknowledgement of the complexity of our feelings. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "But I don't know how to keep you either." Tears filled my eyes, and I felt a wave of sadness wash over me, the weight of our situation settling over us like a dark cloud. Maybe we don't need to have all the answers right now," I replied, my voice filled with a quiet resolve. "Maybe it's enough to know that this, whatever it is, has been real." He nodded, his hand slipping back into mine, his fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that felt both grounding and profound. We stood there in silence, letting the weight of our emotions settle over us, grounding us in the reality of the moment, in the quiet magic of the connection we had shared. As the night wore on, we finally walked back together, our hands still entwined, each step a reminder of the bond we had built, a connection that would forever remain a part of us. When we reached the edge of the path, we stopped, sharing a lingering embrace, a silent promise of everything we had shared. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet gratitude. "For being here, for sharing this with me." I smiled, feeling my heart ache as I looked into his eyes. "Thank you," I replied softly, my voice filled with emotion. For everything. As we parted ways, I felt a quiet joy settle over me, a warmth that filled every inch of my being, grounding me in the beauty of the moment, in the quiet magic of our bond. Our paths might be uncertain, the future unknown, but in that moment, I felt a peace, a contentment that reminded me of the strength of our connection, of the beauty of everything we had shared. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind drifted back to our time together, to the warmth of his touch, to the softness in his gaze, and I felt a quiet happiness wash over me, a joy that lingered long into the night, filling me with the memory of him, of us, of the quiet, beautiful bond we had built together. In the end, there was no clear resolution, no easy answer to the questions that lingered. Our story remained an unfinished chapter, a memory filled with longing, beauty, and complexity. And though the future might be uncertain, the bond we had shared would forever remain a part of me, a reminder of the beauty of unexpected connections, of the quiet magic that had brought us together, if only for a fleeting moment in time.